Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Paulo Sotero. I'm the director of the Brazil Institute here at the center. It is a pleasure to have you here as we review the first 6 months of the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil. This period is marked by, I would say, mostly difficult, negative news, with one good news at the very end of this period of 6 months, which is the announcement of the agreement between Mercosur and the European Union, 20 years in the making. Whether the agreement will be implemented remains obviously a question mark. There will be detailed negotiations now at the different elements of the agreement. It's a complicated matter, but it's important that the agreement has been confirmed. Also, quite important is the lift of veto the United States had on negotiations between Brazil and the OECD geared towards Brazil's accession to OECD. This is a very important information, very important development, was an accomplishment of President Bolsonaro's visit here in Washington in April. Again, remains to be seen how the negotiations between Brazil and the member countries of OECD will develop. We know that this was accomplished thanks to the White House over the objections of the USTR and Commerce Department. So we start in a scenario where it's uncertain. Uncertainty is has been the mark of this first 6 months, but it's not clear whether the president will be able to implement his ambitious and controversial agenda. We are live on webcast. We are live on C-SPAN for this discussion, and I wanted to welcome our colleagues from C-SPAN and the audience following this proceeding. As you know, pension reform, which is key to restoring confidence of investors in Brazil, has inched forward in the Brazilian Congress due to efforts by the Speaker of the House, Rodrigo Maia, and his colleagues, aside from the successful U.S. visit that I mentioned before. Foreign policy remains a question mark in Brazil. We have controversial measures, some of them already reversed at the both in Congress and Supreme Court. Those geared towards education, gender, environment, indigenous rights, etc. As you know, Minister Sergio Moro, the most popular minister of the government, has been under a lot of pressure following revelations of improper exchanges, or what was presented as improper exchanges between prosecutors of the Lava Jato cases, and also in the news, tensions between the president's inner circle and his military advisors, which remains unresolved. Most importantly, the two principal information of this period are unfortunately negative. The economy is not doing well. Predictions of economic growth at the beginning of the period have been revised towards the negative side, and the president's popularity has also dropped. Depending on who is making the calculation, it has dropped precipitously in this first 6 months. Well, to discuss all that, we have with us a wonderful group of people, dear friends all. Maurício Moura, founder and CEO of Idea Big Data. Andrea Murta, director of North America for Jota Business. Jota is a very successful, award-winning now online publication in Brazil. Monica DeBol, director of Latin American program at the School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, Johns Hopkins University, and also at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. And last but not least, Tiago de Aragão, partner and director of intelligence, ARCO Advice, and senior associate at the Center for Strategic International Studies at CSIS. They will speak in the order you see here in this little plates, and I would invite Maurício to go first. He has a PowerPoint. I believe that Andrea also has a PowerPoint.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks, Paulo, for the invitation. Good morning, Andrea, Monica, and Thiago. I have some numbers, but I'm going to start saying that the first 6 months of Bolsonaro, we had a lot of fun in Brazil. And I think you Americans can relate to that, because I start watching the daily Twitter from the presidency, and not only from the president itself, but also from his sons. So my first thing is that you guys should be proud to have Ivanka and Donald Jr. as first family. So we had a lot of fury, we had a lot of tweets. We have a Minister of Education singing in the rain. That was an innovation from the government. And also, I'm going to bring some numbers here. And you also have a famous tweet from the Bolsonaro during the carnival about the golden shower. I cannot go into details about that. So. Thank you. But first, this is a small presentation, but the first number that we have, that Bolsonaro, he lost popularity during the first 6 months. His positive evaluation, that when we ask for people to evaluate the federal government, in the beginning, the positive, I would say, people were saying very good and good about the government. They started in a highly expectation mood. But he was losing popularity, especially in March and April. And as of now, we know that he lost popularity basically on the voters that voted for him in the second round. People that basically choose him because he was the rejection that they had for the PT, for the Work Party, not because of his proposals. And actually those voters now, knowing what he's presenting, they are basically saying, I didn't vote for that. So that's... And they are mostly concentrated in the north and the northeast of Brazil. They are mostly middle-income voters. Still, the region of Brazil that the president has the best evaluation is the south of Brazil. But the first message, he lost popularity. And this was very fast, because in average, he lost 15 percentage points in 3 months. And also, the numbers are showing that we have a clear polarization in Brazil. People that evaluate the government very good, and people that very bad and bad. So this is different compared to the initial parts of the government of Fernando Henrique, Lula, and Dilma. And actually, he is polling lower than all those presidents at this moment. The economic expectations are worse when we ask how the people feel that Brazil is going to be 1 year from now. It starts in a much better mood, and he's losing in a monthly basis. The economy is suffering. I'm not going to talk about the economy now, but the expectation about the improvement of the economy has changed in a negative way. So this is something that I want to make the point that no Brazilian president remains popular without the economic growth. There is no popular president with low economic growth in Brazil, and I think everywhere. So this is a key point, that how he's going to manage the popularity without economic growth. However, and I'll be This is the good news. I think I've never seen this level of support to a pension reform in Brazil from the public opinion. I think, I'm not asking if people are against or in favor of the public reform, because it's very hard for the regular citizen to actually say what kind of pension reform is going to be voted in the Congress. But the fact is that people are expecting that the pension reform will be approved, and will be approved this year. And the good news that I feel that the Congress itself have already realized that. So my scenario is that they're going to approve a pension reform this year. It's very hard to speculate exactly which pension reform will go through, but there is a sense in the Congress that you have the popular support for having, at least, well, in the financial market, people are already priced to have a pension reform approved. And this is new in Brazil. And this is, I think it's the good news, because I'm not going to go into the economic parts, but this is different from what we had before. And the expectation of have a pension reform approved is very high. And this is, I think, is the best news that I see on the first semester of the government Bolsonaro. We didn't have that in Dilma, we didn't have that in Lula. However, when you say that the pension, ask people that the pension reform will make my life better, or if the economy is going to be better over the next 3 years because of the pension reform, the expectations are very low. So that's, in one side, it's good because people don't expect the pension reform to be the silver bullet. But on the other hand, they don't see how the pension reform will get back jobs, we got going to back income. So in Brazil, I don't know the exact number, but right now we have around 14 million people unemployed, and another 15 million people that are in the informal sector as well. So this is a critical part of the government Bolsonaro moving forward, because usually in terms of popularity, the governments, they do have 1 year as credit because he can blame the former government. But starting from January 2020, it's going to be very hard to blame other government for him. So I think the economy moving forward is a key component. And I ended up saying two things. First one, the Bolsonaro style of communicating to the public opinion are very similar to the Trump style. You never know what's going to happen in the next tweet. I'm going to give the example of the Mercosul that Paulo was talking about. If you get the tweets about the Mercosul in December and January, the Mercosul was the worst agreement that Brazil could be into, according to the tweets, the presidential tweets. And since Saturday, the Mercosul is the best thing that happened. So you never know what's going to go to the next tweet. This is very similar to Trump. He talks a lot to his base. So he basically communicates with people that like him, that supports him. There is not too much effort and energy to go through to moderate the communication. That's also the Trump style. But like I told, Trump has, at least the economy is moving in the US. In Brazil, the economy is not moving. So the key question moving forward is if that kind of aggressive way to communicate your own base will you remain with this low growth, with this low economic growth? This is a question that I have moving forward, and this is a key point for his popularity. And the last point that I want to make, and that relates to the book that we just published, and it's available online at the Amazon, the ebook version. And if you need some hard copies, we have here at the left. That Bolsonaro brought the campaign narrative to the government. So when you listen to him, he's basically dividing the country. The people that support the car wash operation, people that are against the old school politicians, people that are different from everything that Brasilia has to offer, from the old school politicians, from Brasilia, from the establishment. Every time he feels pressured, he goes against the PT, the work party. So he's basically transporting the narrative that was successful in the campaign to the government. And again, just to conclude here, that works if you have good economic management, if people are employed, but this is not the case in Brazil. So they have a key challenge on the economic side, especially focused on the public opinion.
Thank you. you, Maurício. Andrea, it looks like politics in Brazil, as criticized as it has been, is doing what politics does in most democracies. It is processing proposals from the executive, and what I hear, including from Monica, that I hope to go deeper in that, is that the proposal on Social Security, the key element of the legislative agenda now, is much better now than the original presented by Paulo Guedes to Congress, the President and Paulo Guedes to Congress. So, is politics functioning in Brazil? Is this a way to look into?
That's a great question. It has been a defining one of this first 6 months of the Bolsonaro government. Bolsonaro, when he ran for elections, he made two bets in Brazil, right? He bet that he could win an election without the usual proposals that you did in the past in Brazil, without a strong party behind him, without TV time, and etc. And that bet he has won, obviously. And the second bet was that he could upend the way that politics is done in Brazil, and the relationship between the executive and other powers in Brazil could be completely revamped in a new way. And so far, at least, that has not paid off. His relationship with other powers is being a bit controversial. And if I would summarize what's happening in Brazil in one sentence, is that the economic proposals are actually moving forward in spite of the government and not because of the government. And I'm going to show you some numbers to support that. And just so that you understand what we do at Jota, we have, like Paulo said, an online digital news publication, and we also work with corporations and businesses with some premium products that use our journalistic news gathering together with data polling and analyzing to show trends in government and in agencies throughout the three branches of power in Brazil. So to explain a little bit how these relationships are going on, let me first start with the easiest one, which is Bolsonaro and the Supreme Court. We are coming from a time when we saw the Supreme Court have a very strong activity coming from the elections. It was basically their decisions that set up the stage to have the outcomes that we did. They were very active, they were very powerful, and it was on the discussion at the kitchen table of every Brazilian for about a year, we saw recently. Now that Bolsonaro is in power and we have Chief Justice Dias Toffoli presiding the Supreme Court, we are seeing more of a supporting actor role for the Supreme Court. So they are not trying to impose anything to the government. They are taking a more reactive role. They are not in the business of creating problems for the government. They will act if something is clearly unconstitutional or if there are attacks against the Supreme Court that require an institutional response. But they are not in the mood or in the role of creating issues for the government. They want to facilitate governing, not to be on the side of government, but that facilitating the relationships in Brazil that would help the governing process move forward. And Justice Dias Toffoli is someone that comes from politics, understands politics, deals with politics without too much fear of interfering with things. So he has meetings with politicians, with party leaders throughout the spectrum, and that's the kind of tone that he wants to give the Supreme Court right now in Brazil. In Congress is a bit different. What we're seeing in Congress is kind of the opposite. It's taking a much stronger role, protagonism in the maneuvering of Brazilian politics right now. And the relationship between Congress and the Bolsonaro government is quite difficult. This bet that he made of trying to set up a new tone for the relationship has created a deep divide between the leaderships of Congress and the executive. And those are not helped by tweets or comments that come from the government, come from the president's sons, and et cetera, criticizing the old way of doing politics in Brazil. And we have some measurements to show that. So we do polling inside the Congress to see how the congressmen themselves are viewing the relationship with the executive. And so this first graph here shows the assessment of deputies in the House of Representatives of their relationship to the Bolsonaro government. So these are the congressmen giving grades to how they view the relationship. The average at this point, which was in May, was 3.94, which was a very low average, and it was similar to what we saw with Dilma Rousseff right before the impeachment. He has recovered a little bit, so nowadays he's about 4.8, almost 5. So there was a bit of a recover movement with that relationship based on a number of things, including Bolsonaro going back and allowing certain old-style politics to take place, releasing pork, for example, and allowing people to nominate their own people for positions in state governments, for example, or at least promising to do so. That has provoked an improvement, but it's still a very difficult relationship. So this is the assessment of the Bolsonaro government governability, which is their ability to approve laws that are interesting to them. And it's still not high. It's 4.4. That was in May. It's still about that, not much above 5 right now. And you might ask then, how is it possible that economic reforms are going to happen? And I have a lot of subscribers here in the US that ask me, how is pension reform ever going to pass if you have this type of relationship? And what happens is that Bolsonaro has the luck, let's say, of having sort of a shared agenda with the leaders of Congress. So Rodrigo Maia, the Speaker of the House, is not moving forward with pension reform to help Bolsonaro. He's doing that because he believes it will help himself. His own political agenda, and there's a shared understanding in Congress that this has to happen. We at Jota see on a somewhat conservative number that I can go deeper into, but about 84% chance of the reform being approved at the moment. So it's very high. There is not an organized movement around Brazil to be opposed to the reform. There are pockets of resistance, but not in an organized way that would actually impede this from moving forward. Something else that we do is, together with asking congressmen their opinions and polling those responses, we also do our own assessment based on how they behave on social media, our own news gathering and conversations on the record with congressmen at the parliament in Brasilia, and also the historic data of their voting. And we put all that together to measure chances of approval or to see how each individual congressman is going to vote going forward. The way when congressmen vote together with the government, following the advice of the leadership of government, we call that a high governability. This is actually a historic graph that shows since the second government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso how the governability moved forward in Brazil. So the chances that deputies will vote together with what the leadership of government is telling them to vote. And you can see that it's never been quite easy in Brazil. It goes up and down a lot. You have specific drops in dramatic moments of Brazilian history, including, for example, before the impeachment, when the JBS tapes were released, we see very sharp drops. And since the beginning of the Bolsonaro government, you can see at the very end of the line, you saw a very sharp drop when the relationship with congressmen was very bad, and Congress was sending some messages to government and approving bills, including orçamento impositivo and other things that the government felt that would be damaging to their budget operation to send that message. But it went right up again, and like I said, the shared agenda and also some sort of endogeneity that says that they're not going to put to vote something that they don't think it's going to be approved anyways. So people take out of the agenda of voting in Congress measures that they don't think are going to be approved. That helps the index go up. So Bolsonaro right now is not at the height of what Lula had or at the height of what Fernando Henrique had at the best moments of their presidency. He has never reached that point, but it's not so low as to prevent approval of measures either. This is just for Bolsonaro, and it shows just the frequency of votes together with what the government wants, right? So we did see that drop right at the beginning. That was very strong. When those messages were being sent, they were saying, look, if you don't change the way you talk to us, this is not going to work. But it went up again, and it's at a level that things can still pass. And we still think that there's an 85% more or less governability index, which is the likelihood that Congress will vote together with the expectations of leaders of government in Parliament because of what I mentioned about the shared agenda. Okay. And we calculate there are about 350 deputies that vote more often than not together with government, which is a high number. And it's more than enough to pass even constitutional amendments in Brazil. The new representatives, we had a very big turnaround of new people coming into Congress in the last election. The newly elected ones are more likely to vote with government than the older ones. And here we see how we divide the parties in Congress based on whether or not they are more governist, more on the government side or less. And the blue ones are more on, more likely to vote together with government. And you see that's in terms of number of parties, it's way higher than people that are neutral and people that are opposed to government. Period. So the opposition, you can basically count as the Workers' Party, PSOL, and those are the most, antagonistic, but it doesn't go much beyond that in terms of people that are going to just be against the Bolsonaro government in every stance that they have. This is just a division of parties by those numbers. So PCdoB, PSOL, and the Workers' Party are definitely against the government, but not many else, okay? And just to finish on the pension reform, this is our historic lines of support for the plans of the government. So we have seen a steady increase of support. This graph is from May, but from then on to here, we are seeing it go up again. And it's right now support, which is the blue line, is actually higher than when we had no proposal on the table. Because it was very high before the text was actually presented. That's easy to support something that you don't know exactly what's going to be like. It dropped once the text was presented. It dropped a lot. But once negotiations moved forward, agreeing to take out of the proposal some of the more controversial points of it, rural pensions and support for the most poor population, the lower income population, it went up again, and it's going steadily into a place of approval. I will just end saying that these measurements are focused mostly on economic points, right, on the economic agenda. If you were to measure support for the social agenda of the Bolsonaro government, it's very different. And both Congress, the House and the Senate have shown that they have little appreciation at this point for the most controversial behavioral points that Bolsonaro is proposing, which are important for his base of support. There were plans of his campaign, including loosening regulations for gun ownership or things related to abortion or environmental stances. And on those areas, we do see more of an adversarial positioning from the parliament and the Supreme Court as well. So that should be more of a challenge to Bolsonaro than approving economic reform. On the economic side, we do see a high likelihood that reforms will move forward based on what we see right now in government. Whether or not that will be enough to spur the Brazilian economy, I'll leave that question for Monica to answer.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Well, just to remind you that this month we are marking 25 years of the Real Plan. Today, actually, it is the plan implemented under President Itamar Franco, the Minister of Finance. Then was Fernando Henrique Cardoso. It shows that it took sociologists to implement a successful stabilization plan. That, by the way, just a little bit of propaganda. The idea of that plan was born at the Wilson Center when Pércio Arida was a scholar here in the early 80s. It took 10 years of discussions based on a working paper he produced at the castle. 10 years of discussion that evolved into what was the Real Plan. When the Real Plan was announced, I remember Minister, well, then President of Central Bank, later Minister of finance for 8 years. A dear friend, Pedro Malan, said the challenge here is for Brazil to become a normal country. There is something that Andrea just mentioned, and I wanted to ask Monica to talk about that a little bit, is this business of orçamento impositivo. It sounds very important. It's just budgeting, okay? In most democracies in the world, the budgeting is mandatory. The legislative branch approves the budget. They have the power of the purse, and the executive manages the budget. In Brazil, we had some very special things, and I wanted to welcome Monica and ask her to, as she presents the economic picture, talk a little bit about it.
Thank you, Paulo. Thanks to all my distinguished colleagues on the panel. Let me start off. I thanked you, but I will now take a little bit of that away because you took part of my punch away when you mentioned the real. I was going to use that to open my remarks and say, you know, broadly, bigger picture, just not those 6 months, but bigger picture, Brazil has actually advanced quite a lot since the mid-90s, and a large part of that, if not most of that, was actually due to this incredibly successful, but at the same time difficult to understand, and still difficult to understand for many people, stabilization plan that Brazil implemented in 1994 and then continued on in 1995. So the Real Plan, which now has its 25th anniversary, is really sort of a turning point when you look at the Brazilian economy. The Brazilian economy would not have been able to go anywhere without the Real Plan because of our bouts of hyperinflation that we kept suffering. The Real Plan was conceived by a group of people, many of which were my former professors in Brazil. And the Real Plan had a component of great creativity and great audacity, which was not very well looked upon by international organizations at the time, namely the IMF. The IMF did not support the Real Plan. Including because it had supported previous stabilization plans in Brazil that had failed, so they looked warily on the Real Plan as something that actually had a chance to succeed. But be that as it may, some of the things that the Real Plan actually contained were things that were highly questionable at the time because they were perceived as being heterodox in the sense of not being exactly mainstream. I bring that up, and I bring the creativity and the audacity to the table of the Real Plan, and that's why I wanted to start there, because that's exactly what we're missing on economic policy when you look at the first 6 months of the Bolsonaro administration. So, yes, we have seen a very important push on pension reform, championed by Paulo Guedes, championed by Congress, as was correctly put here. Championed by the fact that we now have, we've now had about 3 years of very intensive discussions on pension reform. So we are about to get it done, and I think that's a very good thing. Pension reform, the pension reform that we are about to get done is going to be very important in opening up fiscal space for Brazil in the medium term. It is a more ambitious reform, even in the version that has been presented by the Special Commission in the lower house, which is a sort of I don't like to use exactly this term because I really don't believe it's all that much diluted, but it's somewhat diluted from what the original plan envisaged in terms of savings over the next 10 years. Nonetheless, it is a very ambitious plan, and it is much more ambitious than what the Temer administration had envisaged. So if it actually goes through and if it is approved, and I have every reason to believe that that's going to happen, then it will be a very important thing for Brazil to get its fiscal accounts in order. How does that translate into the broader economy as a whole? Well, that's where we're missing the audacity and the creativity that I was talking about at the beginning, because most of the first 6 months of the Bolsonaro administration have been spent talking about pension reform and about how pension reform is going to transform Brazil. Pension reform is not going to transform Brazil. pension reform is going to do what pension reform has to do, which is resolve some of the medium-term fiscal issues that Brazil has. But Brazil has a lot more problems than just these medium-term fiscal issues. So when we look at the economy broadly, and when we see how growth has been very, very slow, as was mentioned here before, this is a symptom of something else. This is not a symptom of a cyclical problem that happened a couple of years ago and we're still in the midst of getting it resolved. This is really a symptom of something that I have been called a sort of a, if you wish, a form of tropical secular stagnation. So Brazil is not growing or is growing very slowly. The 2 years when Brazil grew 1% per year, 2017 and 2018, were largely, that growth was largely helped by a bumper crop in both of those years. We did not have that bumper crop in 2019, and therefore what happened? GDP actually contracted a little bit in the first quarter. When you look at other things that seem to point to or seem to signal secular stagnation, we have longer-term trends that have been very concerning for quite a while. So when you look at productivity growth in Brazil, for example, it's been stagnant to falling, depending on the measure that you look at. This is not new. This is something that's been ongoing. It was masked for quite a number of years by the commodity cycle and by all the positive things that were happening in the Brazilian economy, which more or less stopped in 2014. But it's been there. And now that we do not have these other very beneficial factors to help the economy, then it's on full display. So low productivity growth is on full display at the moment and is one of the explanations for why growth is so slow. The other factor, of course, is demographics. Brazil is coming to the end of its demographic bonus, the time when you see the enlargement of the labor force and of the economically active population. And when you couple that with what's happened to educational quality, not educational attainment per se, because that has to do with accession, and that we have actually seen an improvement in. But when you look at the indicators of educational quality, what you see is really very dramatic. Just to give you an example of what I mean by that, when you look at Brazil's scores on the OECD PISA exam, it is really astounding how badly Brazilian students do. Brazil is at the very bottom of those rankings. And when you look at math alone, the OECD has a few levels by which they measure the quality, how proficient the students are in various areas. In math, the level that dictates proficiency is what they call, the OECD calls level 2. There are 6 levels of if you're on level 6, you're doing really well. Level 2 is the minimum, is the bare minimum proficiency you need to have in a given area. In math, when you break down the numbers by socio-demographic or socioeconomic status, what you see is that both on the lower end of the socioeconomic index that the OECD publishes, as well as on the higher end, so in other words, poor students as well as rich students, some 85% of them on average do not even reach level 2 in math. That means that we are basically having a number of students come out of the educational system in Brazil who are not proficient in math. You have similar numbers in reading, and you have similar numbers in science. So this is, right now, the state of play in Brazil, which, of course, when you look at this picture longer term, does not bode well for productivity trends looking out into the future, at least when we're thinking about labor productivity in general. So that's a concern. The second aspect that I think is important to mention is interest rates. Brazil has achieved right now for many reasons, interest rates in Brazil are very low at the moment, real interest rates. So when you take interest rates and you discount inflation. We tried to do this under Dilma Rousseff in a way that was not reflective of the underlying conditions. So in other words, Brazil tried to force real interest rates to be low under the Rousseff administration, and that turned out to be very bad because it basically disorganized the economy. Right now, real interest rates are low because the conditions have allowed real interest rates to be low. And all projections point to real interest rates remaining low over the medium term. there are no inflationary pressures. Unemployment being very high means that wage pressures are not present. They're non-existent at the moment, and that basically means that inflation is pretty much contained and it will remain fairly stable. There have been a lot of calls for the central bank to reduce interest rates in order to bump up growth a bit, but I have my doubts as to whether that would have any effect at all, because when you look at the current level of real interest rates, which are at about 2 to 2.5%, depending on the measure of inflation that you use, what's been happening is that despite those low level of real interest rates for Brazilian standards, you do not see a reaction in the economy. So investment is not reacting, consumption is not reacting. So that's a symptom of a type of secular stagnation, which seems to be affecting the Brazilian economy at the moment. So all of this taken together basically means that pension reform is a great thing. It's not going to bring growth back, because there are a number of other things that we would need to do on the structural front to sort of face these issues, these longer-term growth issues. And in addition to that, and I bring back the creativity and the audacity now, you need to have some kind of bridge in the short term, especially if you're facing these very high levels of unemployment and the parts of the labor force that are or the parts of the population that are actually finding employment at the moment are finding very precarious employment. That leads to a significant rise in social tensions over time, especially in a situation where social programs are not really the focus of the economic agenda. So there are a number of things on the economic agenda which are positive. Pension reform is positive. Privatization is positive. Opening up the economy, and I will talk about EU, Mercosur, Paulo, if you allow me a few minutes. Opening up the economy is an important thing. There are many things which are part of this agenda which are very important. One thing that's sorely lacking is any mention and any idea about what to do with the social programs that currently exist, how to strengthen social safety nets in Brazil, and how to even sort of just rebuild some of the social safety net that has been affected by the 2015-2016 recession. So high unemployment without a social safety net is not a combination that is particularly good to have, especially in a moment where where growth projections going outward don't seem to lead anybody to think that they'll be much higher than 1 to 1.5%. So that's a situation that requires, as I said, creativity and audacity to think about the short term. So what can be done in the short term to help this economy? I believe that there are some things you can do on the social programs front. There are other things that you can innovate on and do to help the economy along. I will leave those thoughts to Q&A. Let me make a few comments on the other side of the Bolsonaro administration, which Andrea mentioned, and which I think are important. And yes, I'm dodging your question on the budget for the moment. So on the side of the things that have been put on the table, we have seen a lot of moves on the environment, a lot of backsliding on environmental issues. We have seen backsliding on indigenous rights in the Bolsonaro government. We have seen backsliding on gender rights, minority rights. We have seen inequality increase. All of these things are very concerning. The EU-Mercosur deal is actually quite a nice thing to have at this point in time, precisely because of that. We don't know yet what's in the agreement because the agreement in principle has not been published. However, we do know that there is a chapter on sustainable development that touches on environmental issues, indigenous rights, labor standards, and some of these other issues pertaining to minority rights and so on and so forth. So, as I said, we don't know the text. We haven't seen the text. But apart from this being a trade deal that opens up markets and is important for Mercosur countries, and in particular for Brazil, which has been an economy that's been so isolated from the rest of the world for such a long time, it's also an important agreement to help Brazil, or to help the country, to continue to make progress, or at least not to revert itself on some of the issues where it had made significant progress in previous administrations. And when I say that, I use the plural because it starts way back in the Cardozo administration. So advances that we've made on environment, advances that we've made on gender issues, advances that we've made on indigenous rights, all of that, we can't have a backsliding on these issues now, especially not with an economy that's already weak. And I think this is one of the key elements of the EU-Mercosur deal, which will, in a sense, put the Bolsonaro administration on a leash that it really needs to have at this point in time, not to allow that kind of backsliding. So I'll end my comments there.
Thank you very much, Monica. Now, the easiest and most difficult question goes to you, Thiago. Where do we go from here?
Well, the previous 6 months, I think everyone here explained very well. And I think it's clear for everyone who follows Brazil, even remotely. There were some positive things, like the pension reform, which was mentioned here, without getting deep into the merit of who is the father and who is the mother of the pension reform. It's going on. Second, the Mercosur-EU deal was a very big news, which is very positive for the country as well. Third, I would add, there are some potentially good projects that are moving forward, for example, like the debureaucratization agenda through the economic freedom provisional measure, for example. It's something that will eventually help businesses to thrive. And if the potential agenda, if things keep, if there is some convergence of ideas, can be potentially good as well, such as privatization and tax reform. However, and the however, unfortunately, is the slightly easiest part to talk about. I'm going to try to forecast the next 6 months like this, as if it was the next 6 months in 1 minute YouTube tutorial. One of the biggest problems produced by this administration so far, in my perception, is the continuous attempt to disqualify politics in general, politics as a whole. And the more that the government disqualifies politics as a whole, you transfer the perception of whether politics is good or bad to individuals who are fully involved through a highly emotional lens towards what's going on in Brazil. So what I see is that, let's look at Lula in the past. Lula, his cushion of protection of popularity were several of his social programs. And his social programs was such a strong cushion of support that even today, after the unveiling of the largest corruption scandal that we've seen in the Western Hemisphere, this is still something that people hold themselves to justify their defense on former President Lula. Bolsonaro's cushion of popularity is what is called the cultural agenda of this attempt to rephrase certain cultural habits, plus the anti-politics approach. This discussion of popularity might guarantee him throughout his presidency around 20 to 25% of solid voters backing him up. And we can see a parallel in a very similar way to what goes on here in the US. There is a cushion of support on President Trump that enjoys his anti-politics narrative and his cultural reaffirmation agenda on something different than what they had experienced before. The problem is the day after and the consistency of maintaining such agenda. For example, the anti-politics narrative is a point of inflection for any government in the world. First, because it strengthens your solid base of support, but second, it weakens your relationship with other powers of the government, of the union, particularly the Congress. So the more that you strengthen this smaller group of solid support that can at least guarantee you certain types of narratives for the long run, it weakens your ability to maintain a healthy dialogue with the Congress in order to accomplish what you expect to accomplish. So let's look at the pension reform, for example. The pension reform was extremely well explained here as something that was incorporated by the politicians as a whole and by society as something highly necessary for the country. So whether in the future we're going to debate if this is something that Bolsonaro supported or had his participation in the approval was 10, 15, 30, 50, 80%, it doesn't matter. But the pension reform is there and it's going to be approved. And I agree with Monica. It's not going to unveil this door of the paradise of Atlantis in which we're going to find golden grounds, golden trees and caramel sky. It's not going to happen like this. However, once the pension reform approved, we will invariably have an improved perception of the government from society. From there on, the government has two options and two choices. Whether the government will reorganize and have a peaceful dialogue with Congress, or the Congress will continue with a conflictive dialogue with Congress. Let's all remember that the more popular support you get, and this is even in our personal lives, the more bold and cheeky you can get as well. So the more support that will emerge from the pension reform approval could lead the government to opt for a more conflictive approach to the Congress, reinforcing the agenda of the anti-politics that guarantees this nucleus of 20-25%. If the government, however, believes and understands that seeking a peaceful narrative with the Congress, the next step would be potential advances in other agendas, which is great. However, these potential advances in other agendas would lead again to two crossroads. One is the necessity of political nominations, which is something that this government has done, but hasn't done as much as the previous administrations. And the second alternative is the paralysis of the cultural agenda, because it's not something that matches a peaceful dialogue with Congress with the advancement of a cultural agenda. They are not compatible. And this would lead potentially to the loss of these 20-25% core supporters. If the government opts for a conflictive dialogue with Congress, what we're going to see from Congress, feeling that their responsibility with the approval of the pension reform was accomplished, they will counterbalance the pension reform, approving excessively good proposals. And what are excessively good proposals? Let's say, for example, changing the rules for the readjustment of the minimum salary in the country for workers, or approving the increase of the salary of the paycheck for civil servants. So the Congress would initiate a series of approvals forcing the president to veto. And then, based on a perception that although the government has a majority, as well shown here, we can affirm right now that if we combine the centrist parties, the opposition parties, and part of the alliance parties, I would say that today, at least there's a slightly more majority in the Congress that doesn't want re-election compared to those that want the re-election of the president. And what is, in the mindset of the Congress, the easiest way to guarantee that he would further lose support? Sending things that are complicated to the budget, but socially positive, to force the president to veto. Mm-hmm. Where this would come from? This would come from a conflictive dialogue with the Congress. So, what we have from now on, we have a technical agenda from now on, particularly from the approval of the pension reform, in which the route that will guide us for the next 6 months, 8 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, it's based on behavioral politics and not necessarily to something structured, or not necessarily to approve of certain things. If there is a conflictive dialogue with the Congress, let's imagine the worst case scenario of this conflictive dialogue with the Congress could suddenly start debating the political reform, which is something that many Brazilians have discussed in the past. And what if the agenda of the political reform advances so well to a point that they start to debate re-election, whether re-election should continue or not? So, this administration will have a major choice in front of them, whether they strengthen their solid base of support, this 20-25%, in detriment of the rest of the support that the president still has, in the name of a cultural agenda that the parliament doesn't want, or will the government engage in a constructive narrative and dialogue with the Congress, abandoning a cultural agenda in which the Congress doesn't want, and seeking a reformist agenda that could lead to a victory as big as the pension reform, which is the tax reform. So I think that these are the routes that we have in the short term for the next 6 months.
So we start with comments here, then Monica, go first. And then.
So thank you, Thiago. I think that was a very nice way of sort of doing a probability tree of different scenarios that can play out. Let me say something about the conflictive aspect and some of the things that might arise, because there was one that Thiago touched upon, which I think is crucial. So for anybody who follows Brazil closely, you will know that Brazil has had, and it expired this year, a minimum wage rule. Whereby the minimum wage was set as the inflation rate of the previous year and the GDP, the growth in GDP of the previous 2 years. That had been in place until 2019, and minimum wages in 2019 were still readjusted in that manner. That rule has now expired. So one of the things that has already been under discussion, and of course the opposition in this conflictive dialogue, this is not the PT opposition, but the rest of the opposition that has distanced itself from the PT and which is trying to find some kind of middle ground and trying to rebuild whatever sort of left, center, politics there might still remain in Brazil. What they're trying to do now, because of the lack of concern of this government with respect to social policies, is to find some kind of alternative for this minimum wage rule. So I have learned of a number of discussions that have been ongoing about sort of what should be the minimum wage rule going forward. Should we have something similar to what we had up until 2019? Let me make a comment about that. The fact that we included the growth in GDP of 2 years before in the minimum wage rule never made sense. It makes complete sense to protect the minimum wage from inflation erosion. So correcting and adjusting the minimum wage for whatever inflation happened in the previous year, that makes sense, economic sense. Adjusting it for GDP growth does not. And in fact, in the way that the previous rule worked, it made for minimum wages, which fluctuated and oscillated quite a bit. Minimum wages still index a lot of stuff in Brazil and a lot of expenditures, which then make the rule very relevant for how you're actually going to execute the budget and your capacity to execute the budget. So knowing exactly how the minimum wage rule is set is very important. So it is very, very possible, and in fact I would say the likeliest scenario, that in a conflictive, or even if you don't have an exactly conflictive, relationship between Bolsonaro and Congress, that somebody's going to come up with a minimum wage rule that doesn't make a lot of economic sense, but truly rings a bell in terms of, oh, okay, this government's not doing anything on social issues. At least we have this minimum wage rule that's being proposed, and which could have severe consequences for the budget and the fiscal issues going forward, undoing part of what the pension reform is meant to do. This is not a low probability scenario. This is a fairly high probability scenario, I would say, today. So the minimum wage point, the point about conflictive relationships, and the point about, how the lack of this government having a social agenda, all of these things mixed together make for a scenario that may take away from the gains of the pension reform that we should not ignore.
Andrea, do you have any comments?
Just a quick one that supports what my colleagues here were just saying. what is the problem with having a strong, very, a protagonist Congress moving forward as well? From an electoral point of view, Congress and the executive have different interests. So the Congress is going to be much more interested in supporting the states where they come from, many of which are in a very dire fiscal situation. Improving the situation of states, several of the proposals that are being discussed right now would create fiscal problems for the government that could, like Monica said, undo the fiscal savings that the pension reform could bring to Brazil. So it's so likely a scenario that technicians at the government, at the Ministry of the Economy, are already discussing how to sort of put brakes on certain proposals to change, for example, the rules of how you consider the health of the fiscal situation of states in order to give them loans from the central bank. That could mean a very big hole in the budget of the executive going forward. So the strengthening Congress in such a way that undermines the trajectory of the executive in that way could put the fiscal balance of Brazil in great jeopardy.
Maurício, just and then we will open for your questions.
I want to make a point about the relationship between the executive branch and the Congress. The bad news moving forward that I don't see, as of today, any political leadership from the presidency to get this relationship better. But on the other hand, like Andrea was saying, those politicians in Congress, they are rewarded by voters. More budget they get from the federal government to their local states, to their districts, more votes they get. So their main agenda is to get federal resources. So, and the government has the budget. So the good news is we have a lot of parties in the center. And those parties, those politicians, the good news is that they are always open for business. So
it's what in the United States, I think it's called pork. Yes. Questions, please identify yourselves, but wait for the mics to come to you. I think we have 2 mics. Yes, Marcelo, go first. Please identify yourselves for the group. And yes.
Marcelo Averberg, Inter-American Development Bank, retired. I am surprised by the fact that Monica doesn't mention the income concentration as one of the main source of stagnation in Brazil. You talk about social policy, but you didn't say what kind of policy, social policy, you means. So I would like to know what is your opinion about the role of the income concentration in the historic stagnation in Brazil.
Thank you for that question. I didn't think I'd have to say anything about inequality because I did mention that from 2015 to 2016 we have seen inequality rising and poverty rising as well. That's just data. That's what the data tells us. Historically, income concentration. The research on that, as you well know, the research on income concentration and growth is very mixed. So empirically, we have evidence that supports that inequality, higher levels of inequality stunt growth. And we also have some cross-country evidence that doesn't seem to show much in that way. So empirically speaking, it's kind of hard to say. In the case of Brazil specifically, because income inequality has always been such a big issue, and here I'll go back to Real. So thank you for that question because it forces me to go back to the Real plan. The Real plan was one of the major income equalizers that we had in Brazil in the mid-90s. When you look at, for example, what happened after the Real plan was put in place, we had 4-digit inflation, and then, soon after it was implemented, it went down to 1-digit inflation. When you look at poverty numbers, for example, and what happened to poverty numbers, after the Real Plan was put in place, it's very striking how poverty was immediately reduced. And it's not a surprise. Inflation acts as a tax. It is a tax. It is a tax on the poor. It's an extremely regressive tax, so it affects the poor more than it does other segments of society. So it's not surprising that when you have an inflation stabilization plan of that magnitude, that you would see exactly that kind of result. Then we had several years where essentially we had, we had a lot of financial crises after the Real Plan, and not much else could be advanced. We started, with some social programs that later were consolidated into Bolsa Familia, as you well know. But for a while, after that first effect of stemming from the Real Plan, we didn't really see much in the way of progress towards, more a further reduction in income inequality. That came later in the 2000s, and that came with the consolidation of Bolsa Familia into one program and a number of other initiatives that were put in place by the Lula administration, especially in his first term in office, but also in his second term in office, and which then continued. A lot of that was also bolstered. The reduction in inequality that we then see in that period was the result of that, was the result of the fact that the country was growing in that period and was largely growing because of the external forces that were pushing the country to grow. And on top of that, the things that were being done to the minimum wage. So this rule that I mentioned that doesn't really make a lot of economic sense, it did actually contribute quite a bit, and there's empirical work showing that, including empirical work that I myself had done, showing that there was a significant reduction in income inequality stemming from that minimum wage rule, which was actually not sustainable fiscally. So it didn't make economic sense in that respect, but it did help the country on the inequality front for a while. Then we had the recession in 2015 and 2016. And what we saw was that precisely because of some of those policies, like minimum wage policy, for example, were not going to be sustainable over time, plus the effects of the recession, we have since seen inequality go up again. And we have since seen, levels of income concentration go up. I agree on principle that despite what the empirical evidence has to say on a cross-country basis, in the case of Brazil specifically, that probably hinders growth to a large extent. And when you think about long-term growth, and this is why I was referencing social policies and what else might we do on social policies apart from cash transfer programs, perhaps having programs that are better targeted at specific segments of the population that, are more discriminated against or more sort of feel more the pains of this imbalance that exists within Brazilian society, that removing some of these things might actually, unlock some growth potential going forward. But that needs to be looked at, and the current government isn't doing that.
But that is just one of the major concerns from the congressional leadership. This is what Rodrigo Maia and others are looking to. They are afraid of the adverse consequences, social consequences of slow growth. So, questions here on this side. Can you reach the microphone here to this gentleman? Yes, please identify yourselves.
Thank you very much. Bom dia. My name is James Innes, and I'm at the Perry Center at the National Defense University. Monica, your analysis, which I thought was brilliant, has me asking several questions. Do you fear, given the stuff you said about the attainment of the OECD maths for Brazilians of many classes, that Brazil is in danger of potentially hitting the middle income trap as it seeks to get its way out of the current situation? Second, on the EU-Mercosur free trade deal, do you think, given the positive press that the Bolsonaro government has received because of this, that perhaps Bolsonaro might be tempted to do further free trade deals, perhaps cajoling further Mercosur countries for, say, with NAFTA or the new NAFTA agreement, or perhaps with Brexit Britain? And a final question, if I may. In terms of economics with China, do you see any further development in that relationship? Because famously during the campaign, Bolsonaro criticized China a lot, but now that he's been president for 6 months, he seems to have rolled back on it. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigada. Let me try to remember all of the issues that you raised, and if I forget one of them, just let me know that I forgot one of them. So the first one was on the middle income trap. I think Brazil, the middle income trap is one of these things that, you know, when you look at countries, how many countries have actually been able to get out of the so-called middle income trap? They're very few and far between, at least when you look at the World Bank statistics on this. You know, namely, they're the East Asian countries and a few others, but a lot of countries seem to be stuck in this so-called middle income trap. When we say these things, it kind of lends a sense that, you know, it's inevitable that at some point countries will fall into a middle income trap. I don't think it is inevitable. I think it's a reflection of the policies chosen, you know, and what path you choose to follow. At the moment, the path that Brazil has chosen to follow, and this has nothing to do with the Bolsonaro administration only, although it is severely lacking in terms of thinking about an educational policy, just thinking about the fact that we've already had 2 educational ministers, and both of them have been highly ideological people in this administration. But going back further, you know, the fact that we are where we are on the PISA rankings is not a result of the Bolsonaro administration. It's a result of many, 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 many years of neglect that go way back. So, you know, you don't reach the state where a large chunk of your 15-year-olds don't have the minimum level of proficiency in math, science, and reading just because of, you know, 6 months of badly managing the educational, ministry. It is really a concerted effort over many years. From that perspective, is Brazil at risk of staying in a kind of a middle income trap? Sure, it is. You know, with this level of such bad quality of education and students not getting what they need, you really do not have the kinds of skills in the workforce to deal even with 20th century issues, let alone 21st century issues. Now, we talk a lot about, for example, automation, and how is automation going to hit emerging economies when it arrives there? Because it's very different when you think about it from a developed country perspective and when you think about it from a developing country perspective. When you're thinking about it from a developed country perspective, these are things that have been ongoing for a while, and we have still a lot of questions as to the amount of job displacements that they actually generate. When you get to developing countries, which receive these innovations, they're not necessarily in the process of creating them. The process is not gradual. The process is abrupt. And then when you think about, okay, you have a workforce that's highly, you know, low-skilled and broadly unqualified, and then all of a sudden you're going to be hit by this major technological shock. What is that going to imply for the country, thinking about, you know, sort of the real long-term perspective on this? And it certainly doesn't look very good. So I'd say that, yeah, at best we're caught in a middle income trap. Maybe if we don't do anything, we might even be at risk of backsliding on long-term growth trends. On the EU Mercosur and whether it opens the door to new deals, I can only cross my fingers and say I truly hope so. There are countries that are interested in having deals with Mercosur, notably Canada. Canada is a country that's been involved in conversations with Mercosur for a while, and maybe this is the push that those conversations need. Now, of course, as Paulo was saying at the very beginning, you know, deals like of the magnitude that EU Mercosur are, they're not implemented immediately. I mean, this is a long process. There's still some negotiations to finalize. Then there's all the legal judicial reviews. There are all the technical reviews. The agreements have to get signed. It has to get ratified by the different parliaments. So we're talking here about, you know, an agreement not being in place for another 2 to 3 years at best. But nonetheless, conversations with other countries can start in the meanwhile. And there are many countries with which those conversations could start. Canada is one of them. The UK might be another. And of course, this administration does have the ambition of pursuing an agenda with the US. So maybe that will be a push towards that too. We don't know. But certainly it does pave the way for this administration to be less anti-globalist in the sense that they had begun making their statements about, foreign policy and trade policy more generally and becoming more open. So it's, I think, a very good move in that respect. And then finally, your third point, which was China. On China, it's still very hard to read this administration because while what you said is true, so Bolsonaro started off on a path where he was trying to emulate Trump and essentially say things that, Trump would say about China and position himself in that regard. He then got a lot of pushback, of course, from the agribusiness community in Brazil, which sells a lot to China. And of course, they were not interested in having any kind of geopolitical problems with China. So he seemed to backtrack. But then we just had the G20 meetings, and Bolsonaro was supposed to meet with Xi Jinping, and apparently the Chinese leader was delayed by 20 minutes, and Bolsonaro decided that he was just going to jump on the plane and go home. So it's very strange, to say the least, and it's very hard to read. What is the true stance of the Bolsonaro administration with respect to China? Very hard to read. The business community, it's very clear. The business community does not want any kind of problems with China, much to the contrary. But the administration, question mark.
Okay. Thiago, do you have any comments on China? Because you have been writing some about it. So.
Look, the relationship with China is something that this administration is forced to try to have a positive stance. So it's not by option, it's not by conviction, it's by necessity. And it's not even by the necessity of the administration, it's by the necessity of individuals who supported the administration, particularly on the campaign period, and now what they want in return is at least to maintain slightly healthy this relationship with China. On the other hand, since it's Brazil overall is going through a very an environment in which you're either for or against, you're left or right, you're pro, or you have to choose sides. When we look at the internal problems of the administration, what we have right now, the economic unit of this administration was able to isolate itself as an individual part. The military unit has, not by their option and not even by their own gestures, maintained a direct rivalry with the ideological unit of the administration. Basically, I should have put the other way around. So when the ideological unit moves towards pro or against a specific subject, most of the time is a reaction towards another influential part of the government who thinks otherwise. So China, for example, is an example of that. When the government was elected, the Vice President General Mourão, he said something that until today many people in Brasilia mention. He says that Brazil should maintain an equidistance between the United States and China. And what he was mentioning of that is on the nature, not of what you prefer, but of the measurement of importance of the two countries. So when he defends an equidistance towards these two nations, part of the government interprets that as a rejection to their initial idea, which is clearly opting for one over the other. So what we have is that the posture towards China is not a consensus within the administration. There are individuals, departments, and layers which are very pro to have business with China. There are others that are against. There are others that believe that you have to choose between the US and China. And there are others that said, look, we don't need to choose. We can operate on the two lines. And one of the things that perhaps is slightly gaining momentum, perhaps not yet after what happened at the G20, is that doing business with China is not necessarily liking what China does. So the relationship right now is still at crossroads. Brazil is a country that can enjoy some success depending on how the trade war between the US and China moves forward. This is something that could benefit Brazil. It could also bring some unpredictability, because you cannot engage and change your entire strategies based on a conflict that could be solved tomorrow or the day after. But I don't think that Brazil right now, and particularly based on what Monica said of our economic prognostics, Brazil is not in a moment right now to choose. Brazil is a moment to harvest everything of possibility that has in front of the country, particularly a country that depends on commodities. And I believe that perhaps as the year goes by and as 2020 begins, and if the pension reform doesn't produce the economic success and wave of benefits that some people in the government expect, perhaps this could be the trigger to a more pragmatic perception of how a relationship with another country should be.
Okay, questions, please. Ben.
Thanks very much. I'm Ben Young. I'm a political anthropologist from the State University of New York, and I'm presently here at the Wilson Center as a scholar. So I wanted to ask a question about the matter of public opinion. I suppose the question is directed to Maurício, but I'm interested in anyone's response, really. So I'm interested in how recent revelations by The Intercept about Minister of Justice Sergio Moro, it has to be mentioned today, right? I hope this has to come up. Revelations about the investigation of Lula, and we could add the non-investigation of Fernando Henrique Cardoso and other items, how these revelations may be impacting public opinion around Bolsonaro, around corruption, around democracy in Brazil. So would anyone like to comment on that?
Oh, thanks for the question. First of all, most of the people do not understand what's happening in the Intercept case. So, yeah, so they don't understand why it's a website, what did they come from those conversations, if those conversations are really true or it's fake news. So there's a lot of misperception, lack of information. And I want to point two things. First one, Minister Sergio Moro is more popular by far compared to Bolsonaro. He entered the government. In our polls, he has around 70% of popularity, of approval rates, actually twice as much as Bolsonaro. He lost in the couple weeks, like 5-6 points in a marginal way. But he puts himself now in the narrative of the polarization. That's the fact. He's basically saying in his public appearances that if you are against Lava Jato, you believe on those Intercept dialogues. If you are in favor of Lava Jato, you can't believe on those things that are being released. But politically, Minister Moro is in a trap because now he depends on Bolsonaro. And before he was more popular than Bolsonaro, and that only happened with Fernando Henrique and Itamar Franco. Fernando Henrique was more popular than the president. But Moro is still, from the public opinion view, is a popular figure. He's now playing to the division, the polarization, which I don't think it's a good thing for the Brazil as a whole. But politically, he's much more dependent on the figure of the president. And I think this is the key outcome.
So this is based on impressions and not on data points, because we're still trying to measure the impact of all the revelations. It complicates Moro's position much more politically in terms of how inside the government than outside, than within society. It might actually help him politically in society because it puts him in the position of the victim that needs to be protected, and that spurred, for example, the protests that we have seen over the past weekend, right? Politically, in Congress, for example, you have a lot of deputies and a lot of congressmen that are not in favor of all of Moro's actions at Lava Jato and are not necessarily supportive of Lava Jato, maybe not publicly, but on a personal level. You saw, for example, that immediately the Senate started discussing again the 10 measures against corruption, and that have implications for circumventing a little bit the power of judges and other authority figures in Brazil, it might mean something that, it might make a tiny bit more difficult an alleged path to the Supreme Court, for example, because it would make the questioning of Moro much more controversial within Congress. But that's within, that's what Maurício said. It makes him more politically dependent on Bolsonaro inside of the government for his position as a minister, but not necessarily outside in society.
Okay, let's, Monica, you have a small one.
I wanted to make a point about the demonstrations that we saw yesterday and that we saw on May 26th, which goes straight on into this question. So defending, this is based on observation. Again, it's not based on surveys or data points or anything like that. It's just based on what we've seen. So on May 26th and yesterday, we saw demonstrations across the country, which were a mix of demonstrations in support of Moro, demonstrations against Congress, and demonstrations against the Supreme Court. These three issues have now kind of banded together and unified a group of people who are going out in the streets to call for these three things: defense of Moro, against Congress, and against the Supreme Court. They're kind of contradictory in terms, because if you're going to defend Moro and his let's say his track record as a judge, and if you're going to support him and therefore implicitly the judiciary branch, you can't be at the same time, saying that you want to close down the Supreme Court. But there you have it. There you have exactly a sense of how confused public opinion in Brazil is right now, and how it kind of harks back to the point that Maurício was making, how people are having such a hard time actually getting to the bottom of what these revelations really mean, because everybody's looking at everything in Brazil with ideological lenses only. Nobody steps back from any issue to say, okay, wait a minute, what's right and what's wrong about this? What is this revealing or not revealing? What kind of implications might this have or not have? Is this broadly right? Is this broadly wrong? Let's listen to what experts have to say. All of these attitudes, and this will sound very familiar, I think, in this room, all of these attitudes have gone completely out the window. But in a society where the levels of education, and I keep coming back to this point, where the levels of education are very low, including amongst the elites, you do get this sort of confusion which isn't resolved. And therefore, the level of polarization and the political repercussions that this might have going forward are quite disturbing.
Just add to that my observation, please correct if I'm wrong, but I have been in Brazil quite a lot recently, and I have the impression that those rallies, pro or against, is what we do on Sundays now. And I wanted to ask the two experts in polling data here, how significant are those protests? But let's go to the next question. Oh, right there, please, the lady here, yes.
Good morning. My name is Griselda Ramos, and I think Monica's last comment is a great segue into my question. So it seems like we're living in an era where a tweet can seemingly disprove or at least cast doubt about what is factual, and I wanted to see if anyone in the panel, speaking from either experience within your respective industries or in general, what mechanisms can be put in place for the public to believe accurately sourced sound data, or what are innovations being made in order to regain and restructure that public data and public opinion on believing that data.
Just remind us who you are.
Griselda, and I am a graduate student at Johns Hopkins SAIS.
She's my student.
It shows. Yes. Maurício and Andrea, I think, should go first.
Just to give a number, actually, during those days, actually, when you know what you're talking about, is not a good thing. So that's a... I have asked if people believe in experts from TV or famous newspapers or radios, and 26% of Brazilians believe in experts' opinion, but 52% believe in family, friends, and things that they got in their WhatsApp. So So that's a different, that's a very bad issue. And of course, when our leadership, our political leaders also emphasize that, of course, it doesn't help. It happens in the US here, it's happening in Brazil, it's happening in Europe, so everywhere. The media and the experts, I don't know, it's not good to be an expert and actually knowing what you're talking about. Yeah.
No, I'll just agree with Maurício. I think what we're seeing is just a reinforcement of people's position and cementing of their positions, and it's not changing anyone's minds. There's a lot of effort in place to try to, for example, combat fake news and monitor social media and try to bring people into a dialogue across the aisle. None of those efforts have been very successful at this point. I think this is a question for the entire world. It's not just Brazil that's facing this. I'll mention that this is very much a concern in Brazil, including in Congress. We might see very soon a congressional inquiry into the role of social media in elections, in an investigation that might go back to the previous election that we saw. I don't have a lot of hope, honestly, that it will change anything, but definitely, my impression is also that the main source of news in Brazil right now is WhatsApp and not anything that people read on the news.
The family group, that's the main source.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, Thiago, go for it.
Can I say something too?
Very briefly, then Thiago, then Peter.
Okay. Without disagreeing, just so we go in order. Without disagreeing with my colleagues, as a professor, I have to say that I do believe that we can break through, and we can break through, and we can make people listen again. How do you do that? I have no idea. But quite frankly, as a professor, I just can't believe that we're going to be stuck in the dark ages where people just don't believe in anything anymore. My own humble sort of undertakings in that area have had to do with using social media to break down complex issues. And I found that, when you do that, when you break things down for people, and when you break things down in language that people can actually understand, so not using a lot of technical terminology, but really using sort of simple language to say, look, this is how, let's say you want to talk about the EU-Mercosur deal. Break it down, tell them exactly what that entails, what it involves, what's good about it, what's potentially, how could it potentially impact countries, and so on and so forth. People do engage. Of course, there will always be the bots, right? And the people who will say, oh, this is not worth anything, this is not worth reading, this is not worth, and will attack you. But if you just disregard them and you actually engage with people in that way, you can find engagement. And people are looking, because things are so muddled and so confused, people are looking for that kind of thing. And people are open to that kind of interaction. So again, as a professor, I cannot believe that we will not be able to break through this. That's my.
If you're not following Monica on Twitter, you should.
Yeah.
Just a very fast remark on that. We are in a cultural age that we desire speed. We desire speed when we buy something from Amazon, and if we are able to pay for it to arrive one day earlier, we do. We order food at home. And information is treated with the same desire that we have to be satisfied immediately in terms of the information that we're looking for. And on top of that, it's very easy for us to mix up facts with opinion. And several facts are disguised as opinion, and several opinions are disguised as facts. And the volume of information that we are able to collect because of the speed that the information is delivered makes us feel secure that if we got something wrong right now, we will get the right version 30 seconds from now, 1 minute from now, 2 minutes from now. On top of that, the source always became more important than the content. But as long as the source is individual, not collective, this is why newspapers are suffering a lot. Because once a newspaper is tainted on the perception of the reader that he published 3, 6, 9 months ago something that was either wrong or radically different than your self-belief, it is immediately disregarded as a source of information. The trust comes from individuals that are similar of thought to you, and not from individuals that challenge your thought. So the desire to read something from someone that produces or have the same line of thought as you is way more satisfying than having to read something that opposes your thought and forces you to dig deeper in a period in which we are becoming too anxious to read more than a tweet.
Maurício, and then we go to questions.
To be fair with Monica's comments, when I ask in the same pool that when you get sick, you prefer a specialized doctor or the Google, the specialized doctors are still winning. And the second thing, the PISA, the exam that Monica mentioned earlier, in 2021, we incorporate journalistic knowledge on the exam. And Finland, Sweden, and Norway are teaching kids to fact checks, to understand news, to think about what they're going to share. So this is going to be tackled by education. I believe that only education in all levels, from the kindergarten to college to graduate school, are going to handle this fake news and this experts avoidance that we're facing now.
Peter Hakim from the Inter-American Dialogue.
One, just to say my own view, I think the Dark Ages have an edge right now. But the question, my sense is that there is pretty much agreement among the panel that the core of whether the Bolsonaro government is considered successful or not, manages to sort of sustain itself through the full 4 years, maybe even gain re-election, depends on the economy. And the economy is just overwhelmingly the key issue, not corruption, not crime and violence, not the personal behavior of Bolsonaro or his children, etc. But it's the economy, stupid.
Yes, yes, I agree, because the economy not only has the waves that reach further than the economy itself, but it reaches all of those other topics. And the metric right now of success is increasingly being measured through economy, because in all other social aspects, the level of adaptability from the typical Brazilian is very high. There are areas and pockets of Brazil that are extremely violent for a long time, and with the bizarre inefficiency from the government to tackle those crimes, and still you will find life happening. The understanding is that the metric of the economy, and as we see here in the US as well, it covers up all different types of problems that should be tackled individually. They are placed under the umbrella that the economic development will invariably improve all the other segments that have problems on their own.
Thank you very much. Marilda Aveburg. Right here. Our preferred interpreter.
But now I'd like to ask a question about a former professor as well. I started my professional career as an educator, and I've always believed that the economy, yes, of course, but it all starts and ends with education. So I would like to ask the panel, and perhaps Monica, mainly because you said you have no idea how to deal with this, but you believe that as an educator, you can reach these people. Were you thinking in terms of using mainly the internet in all its forms, and or the educational environment? Because in Brazil, at least from the beginning of this new administration, there has been a lot of negative movement in terms of interfering with universities, interfering with public schools, and this is very scary.
I think I fully agree. I think the battle has to be fought on both fronts. With the universities and with the things that the administration has been doing, and the ideological battles that have taken over the Ministry of Education, these things need to be called out when they happen by people who have influence. We do have a few newly elected Congress members in Brazil, people like Tabata Amaral and others, who have become very influential and who are trying to, wage that battle in a sense. But, others who have space in the media in Brazil have to do that, have to play that role, and that's a very important thing to do. What I meant more by my comment when I made it, even though that's a crucial element, the one that you've just raised, what I meant was people who are university professors, people who are experts in the good sense of that term, people should really be using more and taking more, using more the platforms provided by social media, using more of that space, because you do reach more people that way. That's just the reality. And in a country like Brazil, where everybody has access to a smartphone, they may not all have access to sanitation, but they all have access to a smartphone. You can reach a lot of people if you know how to talk to people, and if you know how to, just translate complex concepts and ideas into simple terms. So we are seeing some of that happen. It is starting to happen. It's starting to happen slowly. My hope is that it happens more and more, that more and more people come into that space, and that they come into that space without the ideology, because that can happen too. That's the trap, right? Is that people come into that space and then they start mixing up fact and opinion. That's a true danger. But I do hope that, people who are truly, truly devoted to just educating the public in a broad sense do that with frankness, honesty, and in a way that actually engages people. And I think there's a lot of room for that to be done.
Maurício.
And just in terms of public opinion, I think the Brazilians should learn to scrutinize any Minister of Education the same way they do the Minister of Economy. Because we have a lot of good professionals in education. I think we have understanding what should be done in education in Brazil. So when the president nominates a Minister of Education, this guy doesn't receive the same scrutinization as the Minister of Economy. And I keep asking myself why. So that's the lesson learned on that.
Yeah, just one last point on that. I think of course it's scary when we look the ideological influence on, but this is not new. This is not something that began now. The ideological poisoning of our universities and our schools began a long time ago. And the same way that we have to criticize how right now they are looking at universities and schools and talking about ideology, the previous administrations, particularly the Workers' Party's administrations, were full on with ideology on schools as well. And in a certain way, this feeling of this conflictive feeling that emerged in Brazil over the past 10 years led to this sort of retaliation of my ideology is better than your ideology. And at the end of the day, the successful schools of Sweden, of Norway and Finland, they have no ideology. It's pragmatic. It's the ideology of the result, of what's delivered. So I think that the reason that we are so bad in our educational results is because we waste more time thinking about the ideological frame of what should be thought instead of what should be thought in achieving the results. So it's not something new. It's something...
Yeah, we have a question in the back there, Josh.
Hello, bom dia. My name is Guilherme. I'm an intern with Eurasia Group here in Washington. And my question is for whoever is interested in sharing their perspective. I'm interested in what the future looks like for the PSDB. And does it maybe look like it might pose a threat to the Bolsonaro government in 2022? Do you expect the PSDB to distance itself from the Bolsonaro administration on social issues, but maybe not so much on fiscal issues? And what will determine whether or not they will be relevant in 2022 presidential politics? And could a guy like maybe João Doria be a serious contender? Thank you.
Should I start or you?
Okay. Let Maurício go first with the definitive answer.
No, not at all. I think the biggest threat to PSDB is the PSDB itself. So that's always has been. Right now they are fighting each other. I think João Doria is the main politician in the party. I think that they're gonna have to handle very difficult municipal elections, including defending São Paulo. I think the most important municipality that they handle right now. But always the PSDB candidate is competitive. But I think we have a long way to understand how PSDB will be in 2022. And but I think they still are. They have a lot of issues to resolve inside the party, and we know that many of people in the party they want to leave the party, include old leadership. So I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, our conversations mostly off the record, so I'll just make it general. PSDB is a party that is not that different in terms of internal divisions than MDB, which is the symbol of the amorphous party that just joins everyone under the same acronym. João Doria is indeed, I think, the owner of the machine of PSDB in an old way. We have people that say if he wants, he can change the name of the party. He just calls the shots now. But the old guard of PSDB is not with him. The old guard is actually looking outside of PSDB right now to see who they may support. And interestingly enough, one name that has been coming up around that old guard is Luciano Huck. So that's something that we're also following closely. It's soon to say what's going to happen presidentially, but one good indication will definitely be the municipal elections that we're going to have.
There's a general crisis of parties in Brazil, so politics became individualized. So the PSDB will go well depending on how well is the candidate that they choose. If it's Doria, probably they will perform better than if it's anyone else. As we've seen, the PSL was a party that many people here never heard of, and now is the largest. So traditionally, the leftist parties worldwide tend to be more organized than the non-leftist parties. And it's even part of the logic of the ideological, which the individualized thought that is defended by non-leftist parties also reflect itself inside the party, creating further divisions, while the goal for a collective thought within the leftist parties tend up to organize them hierarchically internal in a different way. So politics in Brazil, I think, with what we have seen of this dichotomy between the executive and the Congress, the protests in the streets criticizing the Congress. So the general view that parties are part of the problem and not of the solution will lead us to this quest towards individualization. So Luciano Huck, tomorrow he can choose 3-4 different parties, and it doesn't matter which one he chooses because this will not affect how he's perceived. Just as well as if Doria changes party or if Bolsonaro changes party tomorrow, he will carry the supporters with him. So the PSDB, it's a problem of how the kitchen works and not basically which food is being served in the restaurant. They cannot decide themselves inside the kitchen who will emerge with the dish. So if it's someone like Doria, it probably can bring something good. But if it's someone else, the power of the individualization will still be very strong within the political environment.
Yeah, it's something that Maurício, I think, follows very well. There are political actors in Brazil that belong to different political parties. They tend to be more on the centrist side, and they meet all the time, they talk all the time, and they are trying to figure out the way forward. Can you elaborate a little bit on this, please? Revealing secrets here.
No, I can't.
All right.
But they are talking. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's, politics is happening in Brazil. Traditional politics is happening in Brazil. The system is somewhat functioning. And yes, you have to react to tweets, to this and to that. But there is a sense of normalcy in what's happening.
And I've never heard about Luciano Huck.
Yes, and you know who Luciano Huck is, right? He's one of the, let's see, Oprah in the United States, that sort of universe. Well, we are down to one or two final questions. Who would like to ask questions? Okay, sir, go ahead, please. Yes.
Well, I'm Felix Rosansi from Argentina, and as you know quite well, we have very similar problems in our countries. Unfortunately, we are not accustomed to work together, which is a general problem in Latin America. But one of the things that strikes me is that at no point you have mentioned anything regarding science and technology, which, like the PISA, puts our countries in Latin America, but especially Brazil and Argentina, at the lowest grade from the, so it's going to take a lot of time to change education, etc. But what about skipping and trying to make science and technology work? That's my question.
Well, over the years, we have done here with the foundation, Science Foundation in São Paulo, with Interpharma, a series of exercises. There is a little booklet online on innovation in Brazil that's coming out now in English. And the problem is that, well, Brazil, like Argentina, has great scientists, has even great science, but very little innovation. And the problem seems to be how the system is put together. That universities and companies, the systems are closed. That is the problem. In contrast with the United States. So this requires continuous reform, and here maybe I think it depends on ideological positions. The left may be as much as a problem as the right, because more often than not, breaking the silence require taking away people's privileges, and in this academic community, actually. So this is a very tough issue, and we will soon publish online our book on innovation, and I already available in Portuguese. I encourage you to go online, and you can read it online, you can print it. But with that, I would like to thank all of you for your presence here this morning. Thank Tiago, Monica, Andrea, and Maurício. Thank you, our colleagues from C-SPAN that spent the last hour, or almost 2 hours with us. And stay tuned. We will continue with programs like this, and have a great summer. Thank you.